Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk again to Roshan Salih. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome, Salam Paul. Nice to be here again.
Nice to have you back, sir. Roshan has been a journalist. I was asking how long you've been a journalist. Since for 25 years, actually.
Yes, giving away my age.
Extraordinary, as an embryo, extraordinary career. Currently, he's the editor-in-chief of the increasingly important news website, 5 Pillars. Which you can follow on Twitter, and there's a website. Do strongly urge you to subscribe or follow them for important news. And during his career, he's reported from over 25 countries. Highlights include the Iraq War and occupation, the Pakistan earthquake in 2006, the Lebanon-Israel War, the Iran nuclear crisis, the Egyptian revolution, the Libyan revolution, the World Cup, the Olympics, and much more. And so you can follow him. You have your own personal Twitter account, which I'll link to as well below. And he's the author of the book titled Confessions of a Muslim Journalist, My Life in the Mainstream and Alternative Media. Interesting title. So you've been incredibly busy, and actually very grateful that you've managed to find time to come on this platform, because we're living in an historic moment, in a very serious moment in history at the moment. I obviously follow you on social media, and I noticed just recently you were reporting from the International Court of Justice at The Hague, where obviously South Africa has brought a case against Israel for genocide against the Palestinians. And I was very struck that you were there. You were there with the crowds and the people as it was going on. What was that like, just being there at that incredibly important moment?
Well, I think the best journalism, obviously, Paul, is the journalism that's done from the ground. If you're just kind of sitting in your armchair at home and just kind of tweeting and observing, it's not real journalism. Real journalism is done on the ground, where you experience things. That was a very historic moment, because I think it's the first time that Israel has been put on trial in such a public way. And after all, this court, the International Court of Justice, is actually the UN's top court. So literally it's one of the top courts in the world. And there you have, the South African delegation, who were treated like heroes, kind of rocking up and literally making the case for genocide, saying what we all think and what we all know, that the Israeli regime is guilty of genocidal practices, war crimes, massacres, slaughters, etc., etc. But just to see that in such a setting at the UN's top court, to see Israel being put on on trial like this, I think was a very satisfying and historic experience, because it doesn't happen very often, or perhaps has never happened before.
No, I don't know. I mean, just to be slightly cynical, I mean, the significance is very true, what you're saying. But say, I suspect, what do I know? But I suspect that the court will decide that Israel is guilty of genocide. The evidence is so overwhelming. But then, you've got the UN Security Council. USA is a permanent member of that. Can't they just veto any action? And can't ultimately this be an exercise in futility, in that the US does have that power of veto over everything at the end of the day? Is that really the plausible end game, do you think?
Well, there's two scenarios here. One is that obviously they find against Israel, and I think, it's an open and shut case, Paul. I mean, this literally is the first genocide in modern history that's been live tweeted. We're seeing the images every single day. The evidence is overwhelming. It's probably the most recorded and documented genocide in human history. I would actually say more than the Holocaust in World War II, because that was a historical event, and we had to rely on kind of second-party, third-party evidence. And obviously I believe in the Holocaust. I believe it happened, but we didn't have the instant images that are coming through every day like we have from Gaza. So I think it really is an open and shut case. I think if the court finds for Israel, I think it will really impinge. It'll impugn the kind of credibility of the court. And this is the UN's top court, so it will be the biggest travesty of justice, perhaps in modern history. And I think it will. People will obviously lose faith in international institutions, international courts. It'll be a mockery of justice. So I even think the US wouldn't like to see that happen. Of course, this court does not have the power to enforce its diktat. It doesn't have an army. It doesn't have a militia that can just stop Israel from doing what it's doing. But I think the moral and political pressure that will be, kind of put on Israel with a guilty verdict will probably be overwhelming. And I think we already know that because of the, electoral timetable in the US, Joe Biden doesn't want this war to last too much longer because it's hurting his chances of getting reelected. So I think even America might be quite pleased to see a guilty verdict, because that means that Israel will have, a time limit to end this war, perhaps a few more weeks.
So you don't think America would veto then any UN Security Council resolution to enforce this? Because you say it has no power of enforcement in the court.
I don't think it'll get to that point, to be honest. I think that I think America's already putting pressure on Israel to have some kind of time limit to the end. I mean, this war is destroying the Israeli economy, and it's destroying the world economy to a certain extent, with the Houthis blocking the Red Sea and world trade. So I think, Biden is very low in the polls. Trump is going to absolutely kill it when it comes to the election. So I think we have to keep our, there's always a military clock and a political clock, and they work in tandem to a certain extent. Sometimes they're in conflict with each other. The Israelis would like as much time as possible, but ultimately the only country in the world that can stop Israel from doing this is the US. We've already seen some differences in policy between the US and the Israelis. The Israelis are much more gung-ho. They would like to see this war widen. The US would like to see it contained. So I personally think a lot of discussions are happening behind the scenes between the US and the Israelis. And I wouldn't be surprised for the US, whatever they're saying, to be secretly pleased about a guilty verdict. But I think the court is, the last thing I would say about this, Paul, is the court is quite politicized,
Yeah, I've heard that, yeah.
Yeah, so obviously the judges all come from certain nation states.
And which of those? So when you say certain nations, which ones do you mean?
All around the world. So there's an American judge, there's a British judge, a Russian judge, Chinese, there's a Lebanese judge, there's a Moroccan judge. So all over the world, these judges are appointed, but they're all appointed by their nation states. So I think they're quite unlikely to go against the political will of their nation states. So judging it logically, I've counted the number of judges there, and I think there's a majority for Israel. It's quite close. It's a bit of a knife edge. But if one or two judges, judge it on the merits of the case rather than, following the political diktats of their nation state, then I think we'll get a guilty verdict. But if they're going to just literally be political appointees and behave like that, then I think the verdict will go with Israel, unfortunately.
See, I didn't realize that these were political appointees, and that's a very important point, actually, and that's quite depressing as well. Now, did you actually were people able to go into the court? Were you able to gain access, or was it completely?
No, very few. I mean, I must admit, it was the last minute decision for me to go, because another reporter was meant to go but couldn't, so I just went at the last minute, and therefore I didn't have accreditation to go inside the court. But there were very few places anyway. There was only kind of maybe about 10 media crews inside the court, and then the public gallery was very limited as well. So we watched everything that was going on big screens outside. There was a pro-Palestine demonstration, quite large. I would say perhaps up to about 1,000 people, maybe a little bit less. And there was an Israeli demonstration of a similar size, because there are a lot of pro-Israelis, particularly in Holland. And lots of people came from abroad as well, from different areas of Europe, some from the Middle East as well. So it was a massive event, and obviously even from South Africa. People coming from all over the place. But Holland itself is a bit of a right-wing country as well. No wonder.
Wilders is busy. Can you believe it? That man.
No wonder Geert Wilders is doing so well in the polls. So Israel is quite popular in the Netherlands itself. So I would say the Palestinian demonstrations and the Israeli demonstrations in the UK, we've seen the Palestinian demonstrations, 10 times bigger or 100 times bigger. But in Holland, there's more parity.
I didn't know that. It's extraordinary. I noticed you were chasing after an Israeli camera crew. There's a guy they interviewed, and you were giving him a little bit of a hard time, I thought. But what were you up to there? I mean,
we all have different styles. So I've had a bit of criticism for that from friends of mine, but I think most Muslims were happy to see me do it. I've got a bit of a volatile personality, Paul. I know that when we've met each other, you'll think that butter won't melt in my mouth, but occasionally I can get a bit annoyed and angry. And I just felt that, Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're all feeling a little bit powerless and helpless. We can't stop this war. We're seeing a genocide unfold before our eyes, and we can do very little about it. So I felt personally that the least I could do was to put a representative of the Israeli media under a little bit of pressure to make him feel a little bit uncomfortable. So that was my raison. That was my kind of reason for doing it. I only had about 20 seconds. I was told by another journalist that that's Israeli TV. So I went straight up to him and I did what I did. I Googled him afterwards because I thought maybe I'm being a little bit unfair here. I don't know who he is. So I Googled him afterwards. I found his Twitter feed, and he is somebody who supports the Israeli regime. He is someone who supports Israel's actions in Gaza. So I think he was a legitimate target. I only had 20 seconds to say what I said, so it was all off the top of my head. And my goal was just literally to make him feel uncomfortable, a little bit of accountability for the fact that he is supporting what is a genocide, what is in effect a genocide. That's why I did it.
Yeah, and you could, if you follow Roshan on Twitter, you'll see all this pretty much after it happens or whilst it happens sometimes. So do follow him. I sort of change tack slightly to more UK based news, really. And again, if following you expressed strong views actually about the UK government's decision to proscribe Hizb ut-Tahrir, a Muslim political party in the UK, as a terrorist organization. It's quite a shocking development. But why is this decision so important to Muslims in general, do you think?
Well, Paul, Hizb ut-Tahrir are a non-violent, peaceful Islamic political party. Founded in Palestine after the Second World War. Their big idea is Khilafah, to bring back the Islamic Khilafah or Caliphate, to unite the Muslim world under the banner of Islam, under the banner of Sharia law. They've always had a political kind of modus operandi. They've always been peaceful. They don't have large numbers in the UK, but their influence probably outshines their actual numbers because they're quite influential in the media, on social media in particular, and they believe in kind of appearing on the media and expressing their opinions on the media and getting more influence through that. I know their members and their leader personally. These are middle-class professional, very intelligent men. Wouldn't say boo to a goose, have never been involved in any act of violence ever. And I think if you're going to be on a terrorism list with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, then at least you have to have bombs and weapons and plans to kill people and terrorism. None of this applies to Hizb ut-Tahrir. And I just think, Paul, that this is a really black day for British Islam because I don't think Hizb ut-Tahrir are the real target here. I think it's Muslim activism. I think it's they've banned them on the basis of ideas rather than actions. They're not a terrorist organization. Yes, they have controversial opinions in a British context. Yes, they criticize British foreign policy. Yes, they rub certain people in the establishment up the wrong way, but they're not a terrorist organization. They don't have any plans to kill anybody. And I just think that that's where you should draw the line in Britain. When you have an organization that actually wants to hurt people, that wants to kill people and target people, civilians, in a violent way, then of course I think everyone will understand that that's unacceptable. But Hizb ut-Tahrir does not fall in that category. And I just think this is a really black day for Muslims. I think more Muslims should be speaking up about it because it's Hizb ut-Tahrir today and it's us tomorrow. Because I think the real target here is British Islam and British Muslim activism.
Because they're not banned yet, but I understand there's a vote in Parliament tomorrow, and then the likely proscription would happen on the following day, Friday, the 19th, I think, when it will be illegal to give them any support whatsoever. The criminal offence, an imprisonable offence. And I don't know what social media would do, the corporations, in terms of taking down their social media presence on Twitter and YouTube, etc., which is quite extensive, as you say. But I'm interested in you talked about the wider implications here. So you think this is not just like a tightly focused prescription of a political party and its particular leaders and its particular label. You think this is part of a broader sweep that will, criminalize or demonize pro-Palestinian or political Muslim activist sentiment in general? You think this is part of a bigger move?
Yeah, I think it's meant to scare us, Paul. I think, and I think it's working to a certain extent. I think the authorities are genuinely concerned by the effectiveness of pro-Palestine activism over the last 3 months, especially in the UK, especially on social media, because we're kind of excluded from mainstream media to a large extent. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. And obviously that is having an effect on the streets. You've seen these demonstrations week after week in London and elsewhere, hundreds of thousands of people. So I think the authorities don't like that. We know very well that, Suella Braverman didn't like it when she was Home Secretary, and generally the Tory party don't like it, Labour don't like it. And I think it's just kind of a warning shot. Let's get the low-hanging fruit, Hizb ut-Tahrir in this case, and send a warning message out to Muslims in general that you need to start shutting up, and there's a line you can't cross. You're going a little bit too far in your criticism of Israel, in your criticism of Zionism, in your criticism of the British authorities and their support for this genocide.
Just one name came to mind when you were saying all that, about Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party, who was very outspoken, and many would say very brave in his support for Palestine and the Palestinians in their struggle for against occupation. And look what happened to him. There was a successful attempt to take him down, and he was much maligned for being this, that, and the other, which was quite extraordinary considering his political positions against racism and so on. So that this isn't just like, although this has had a renewed emphasis on perhaps suppressing dissent or demonizing it, the former Home Secretary calling them hate marches, the Palestinian marches are extraordinary. But it's not completely new, is it? This goes back a couple of years, I think, to attempt to really manage. It's almost as if Britain is changing from a more traditional, more liberal, tolerant, a country where political refugees were, Karl Marx came here in the 19th century, as a refugee, and, wrote Mein Kampf here, not my Das Kapital, get the right guy, not the other guy. And I mentioned that because we seem now to be moving towards a more kind of top-down European model, like the French and German model, where dissent is managed and suppressed, rather than the kind of more live and let live, at least as far as the Marxists go, not the other one I mentioned by mistake. But are we moving more towards that kind of more rigid authoritarian European model, do you think?
I think we've spoken about this before. I think we both are very familiar with France, and we both live there, we both speak French, and we both know, what the concept of laïcité, secularism, means in France. And I think we're moving towards that model. I think Britain generally has had this model of multiculturalism with diversity, and that's the general model that's been followed over the years, where Muslims have had more space to breathe here and organize and have freedom of speech, whereas in France it's kind of uniformity rather than multiculturalism. Everyone has to be French, and you can't really express your diversity, especially in public spaces. So I think we're moving more towards that model. I think generally what's happened here, it's actually really fascinating, Paul. If you give me a minute to explain, I think British Muslims are unique in the world in terms of diaspora communities. The traditional model of any diaspora community, no matter whether it's Muslim or Hindu or whatever, is assimilation over a series of generations. Integration, then assimilation. And they lose their religion, they lose their languages. And this has happened to a certain extent in America, where American Muslims have become quite liberal and they've jettisoned some core Islamic values, normative Islamic values. I think the opposite has happened to a large extent in Britain, whereas we have, the children of the immigrants of the 1950s and 60s are actually more religious than their parents to a certain extent.
I interviewed a leading academic at King's College about this very point. Professor Linda Woodhead, and she's made exactly the point you just made, based on academic research. Absolutely.
Yes. Oh, that's great. So it's not just an anecdotal thing.
No. I interviewed her about this. It's on the census. She said
I saw that bit, actually. I think I saw a clip on your Twitter. So it's unique in the world that we have actually held on to the rope of Islam in such a tight way. Now, I think the British authorities thought we would integrate and then assimilate over generations, and they can see this has failed. And obviously, it's annoying a lot of people that we are still holding so tightly onto the rope of Islam, not just as a religion that we do in our spare time, but as a way of life. So we think economically Islamically, we think politically Islamically, and not just in terms of rituals. And I think a clash is happening now. And I think the from the perspective of the authorities, and the lawmakers in this country, they can see that we're not integrating like they wanted us to integrate, or not assimilating, like the Hindu community have, like the Jewish community have. Yeah. We're not jettisoning our religious values, and therefore an inevitable clash is happening right now as we speak, and will play itself out over the next few years, where Muslims will be pushed further and further to abandon their normative Islamic concepts, whether that's belief in the Khilafah, Sharia law, LGBT, believing homosexuality is a sin, and other things like that. We'll be pressured more and more to do that. And if we don't, I think the pressure on us will get greater and greater. It's already, getting to the stage where they're banning our organizations, putting pressure on our mosques, restricting our freedom of speech. And I think that is only going to intensify, unfortunately, in the years to come.
And there's a great deal of self-censorship. I know some imams at certain leading mosques in London, I won't say which ones, who do self-censor on certain issues, LGBT, for example, not because they're cowards, but because they're afraid a mob will descend on their mosque, or they'll be prosecuted simply for holding views which are actually shared by the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, most evangelicals. But when Muslims hold them, they seem to upset people for some reason. But just to give an example of what you're saying about this clash, you've been reporting even today, I think, there's a school in northwest London where the headmistress is actually very famous for being the strictest teacher in Britain or something. She has this kind of reputation, but she's actually an appointee. She has a very prestigious background as a government appointee. But anyway, she at her school, allegedly, because I don't personally know the facts, I'm not a journalist or anything, allegedly they had banned pupils in the school from praying at the set times. But I want to stress, reading the detail here, that the detail matters, that the pupils who had been stopped from praying because they wanted to pray, because Islam is very popular, obviously, were praying outside of classroom times. They weren't interrupting the school schedule. They weren't in any way upsetting class times or the education. It was in the playground during playtime and so on. So in other words, they were operating within their own time, even though it was in the school day. But even that has been banned, apparently, allegedly, by the school. And I read the report in the Telegraph today, which was outraged that there's an undertone of outrage that these Muslim pupils should wants to pray during the day, and it was a barely concealed contempt and support, and a lot of support for the very strict right-wing teacher, which she seems to be. But with you reported, it was much more, I think, balanced and sympathetic. That here was, people just wanted to pray, and because it was a physical ritualized prayer, salah, shall we say, rather than just praying quietly in a corner where purely internally, that seems to have triggered certain authorities in the school. But this clash, which is ongoing, I think it's in the court, it's in the High Court or some court, yes, today, which you've reported on, and this is one of the reasons why people, I think, should follow your news website, 5 Pillars, because it really does give a much more balanced view on what's going on with Muslims, rather than the slanted, more Telegraph view, I think, which is quite barely concealed contempt towards Muslims. And if you read the comments from the public, under, all of them are hostile. Send them back. If they don't like it here, go and live in Afghanistan. It's extraordinary Islamophobic, really big and just sheer nasty comments, which is page after page of them, and are looking in vain. I do try and comment on the Telegraph comments sometimes, but I get attacked then. But hey, but so thank you for highlighting that. I mean, do you have any more information about that? What stage are we reaching?
I don't think we should say too much about it, simply because the court case is ongoing. I know that the pupil who was complaining about, a prayer ban was put in place. I don't think it's a case of alleged. A prayer ban was put in place last year by the head teacher and the governing body. It's a question of, was that justified or not? And the pupil gave her evidence yesterday, saying that she felt discriminated against and her right to express her religion, which I think pupils can do in school as well. The school has to provide for that. That was curtailed, and the school, I think, gave its evidence today, so we will be reporting on that as well. Right. The school is very litigious. They tried to get this case heard in private, believe it or not. Yes. They have tried. Even 5 Pillars, they sent us a legal letter asking us to take down a article that we put up about 6 months ago, or a bit more than 6 months ago, So I think we should let the judges decide on the merits of the case.
There are actually attempts to silence you, a journalist, reporting on this very important case in London of a school allegedly stopping pupils praying in a very way.
The school tried to get the judge to hear the case in private because they said there was a threat to the school, a threat of violence to the school. The judge threw that out and said, nope, this is going to be aired in public.
Amazing. So that's why we're talking about it, because it has been now in the public domain, which is how I know about it, because you've now finally been writing about it. So we'll hear about the outcome of this presumably in the coming days, will we?
It'll probably be in the coming weeks. So the wheels of justice turn slowly, but the hearing I think ended today, if I'm not mistaken, and it usually takes a couple of weeks for a judgment to come through.
Right. Gosh, so there's two judgments now that we're waiting for. One is obviously in The Hague, very important one, and this one as well, which matters to Muslims in the UK. Gosh, you mentioned earlier on, we were going to come back to it, I think, about the mainstream media, mainstream journalism. What did you want to say about that? And your do you have a relationship with the mainstream media, or you just operate parallel lives, if you like?
Yeah, not much anymore. I mean, obviously, I used to work in the mainstream and have contacts in there, and obviously, I maintain those informal contacts behind the scenes, and obviously we often go to cover the same events, so we have a chat, but I don't get invited on the mainstream media anymore, or hardly ever. When we started Five Pillars all those years ago, nearly 10 years ago now, or more than 10 years ago, we used to get invited on for several years, quite a lot, and that was when we were a much smaller website and platform. We used to be on the BBC Sky News channel for all the time, myself and Dilly Hussain, mainly Dilly because he had more time to go on than I did, but we stopped getting invited on, I would say, about 4 or 5 years ago. And it kind of coincided when the extremism czar, Sarah Khan, who doesn't like us, she kind of got into office. And then suddenly we stopped getting invited. And lots of very prominent British Muslims like Muazzam Beg and many others who used to be invited all the time, they stopped getting invited. So now the only Muslims that really get into the mainstream media are those without a constituency, you know. We don't even know who they are. Sometimes they're terrible performers. They don't know what they're talking about. And they just get destroyed by whoever they're debating. Or sometimes they're so kind of pro-West and they're very conservative and even anti-Muslim that, you know, they may as well get on Douglas Murray or something like that. So, yeah, the mainstream media doesn't really platform genuine Muslim voices anymore. Occasionally we get through.
But to be fair, are you not against going on shows like Piers Morgan's show? So is it
on Piers Morgan, yeah. So obviously,
you're not wanting to go on certain shows as well as.
No, I think we do believe on going on the mainstream media because I think ultimately we live in a majority non-Muslim country, and we know that, you know, Five Pillars is mainly read and watched by Muslims, so we don't always want to be kind of talking in an echo chamber. We do believe on going in mainstream media as long as it's, you know, it's fair. We get a fair crack of the whip. You know, we're not outnumbered 3-1 by, you know, 3 against, and we're the only Muslims there. As long as our comments, usually if it's live, will go on as well because we don't want to be edited and our comments to be taken out of context. And I was on Newsnight about a year ago, and that was the last time I was on mainstream media, and there was a big gap between that appearance and my previous appearance on the BBC. Now, so we will go on, but there are certain platforms like Piers Morgan, which unfortunately Muslims have been going on. I've always been against going on Piers Morgan, simply because I think it's not an arena for fair debates. Like, we've got nothing against having a fair, even challenging debates and our views being challenged. But what Piers Morgan is trying to do is he's trying to get people prosecuted. You know, and obviously he played a big role in the HT ban as well, because I think if Hizb ut-Tahrir hadn't gone on Piers Morgan, the focus wouldn't have been on them so much, you know. So the government's made a decision to ban an organization, I think, based on a few social media clips on Piers Morgan. So that's the reason why I felt that we shouldn't go on Piers Morgan. Dilly, my colleague, took the opposite point of view. He did go on. I didn't exercise any veto. Perhaps I should have, but I didn't. And maybe that's weak leadership on my part. But I mean, Dilly did quite well. You know, I would mark his appearance like a score draw with Piers Morgan. But I think other Muslims did far worse and were kind of, hung, drawn and quartered.
Yeah, no, it was particularly painful to watch. And there are actually, having discussed this with some of the participants on that show, Muslim, there are strong arguments for and against, actually, and there's some very eloquent and profound reasons to go on, as well as not to go on. So I find myself swinging, depending on who I'm talking to, in terms of what my view is, really. So yeah, but I mean, HT though being demonized through Piers Morgan is very true, and I've noticed Piers Morgan has been tweeting, crowing is probably a better word, on Twitter about Dr. Abdul Wahid, about his what's happening with HT in a very nasty, unpleasant way, and that really soured it. This guy just has no manners. He's just
no, he's a Murdoch hack. He's a Murdoch henchman ultimately. And if you look at the way that, I mean, he pretends to be neutral, but look at the way how he treats his Israeli guests and his Zionist guests compared to the way he disrespects his Muslim guests, cuts them off after a few seconds, doesn't allow them to expand their thoughts or finish their sentences, is always on the offensive, whereas he gives his Israeli guests and his Zionist guests the time to speak, etc. But just look, Paul, I mean, just look at the only reason why we're even considering going on Piers Morgan is because we can't get anywhere else. The BBC won't take us, Sky won't take us, Channel 4 won't take us. So we're relegated to literally going on this platform where we're harassed.
Why won't, I mean, you pointed to some kind of hypothetical, maybe real blacklist almost. You seem to be implying that because you think that is the case, and you're just not going to be right. Okay.
I believe there's a blacklist, and I believe there is a memo that has gone out from, I don't know, maybe intelligence agencies or government departments saying these people are not acceptable. Therefore, you should not invite them on their show. I'm not saying it's an order, but, ultimately people that work for the BBC and these channels, they've gone to school, or they're mixed in the same circles as people in government or intelligence agencies. So it's a revolving door, quite frankly. And I'm sure they've exerted some kind of influence.
Yeah, that would make sense if there's been this consistent non-inviting of people.
Yes, absolutely.
You were invited. Suggests there is something going on clearly, without being paranoid. There's some kind of conspiracy, might be the wrong word, that triggers the wrong idea.
We only get invited on. The only exceptions in the last 5 years or so is when there's a topic which kind of suits them, which makes us look really bad. So they feel like this is like fertile ground where they've got us over a barrel. Let's get them on. And obviously with the intention of demonizing them. And usually we turn down those invitations.
Yeah, no, that kind of makes sense. So talk to me about the future then, given these informal restrictions and formal restrictions, Hizb ut-Tahrir, that are coming into force. I mean, are there any Muslim voices in the mainstream media at all now? Or is it simply, are Muslims now relegated to the alternative media? Yeah. And is that necessarily a bad thing? Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, even Elon Musk says he doesn't read the legacy media anymore. He's on Twitter or X. It is not the real interesting news that young people particularly consume on these alternative platforms like yourself, like X, like TikTok, and so on. So does it really matter so much in terms of you still have a very big constituency, even if it's not Middle England so much?
Paul, well, I'm not begging to go on the mainstream media. It doesn't bother me at all. Okay. I just think that they still have a lot of power, and if the BBC, for example, claims to represent all constituencies and communities of this country, then I think it's only fair that they give Muslims a fair crack of the whip. That's my only point. But no, I'm not desperate to go on the BBC or Sky. I'm quite happy working within the Muslim community. And yes, you're right. I mean, obviously, I'm very interested in the media generally. I'm a student of the media. And what's been happening over the last couple of decades is that mainstream media has been shedding its audiences. So obviously, people don't really read newspapers anymore. They don't really buy newspapers anymore. So when I was growing up, and I'm sure when you were growing up as well, the broadsheets and the tabloids had a stranglehold over information. Yeah. That was the only way that you can disseminate information. Yeah. And then the TV channels like the BBC and ITV would often pick up on their stories and amplify them. But now no one's reading newspapers anymore. So newspapers are shedding their revenue and their audiences. They're becoming far less influential. And also the TV channels as well, kind of terrestrial TV that we used to call it. Now it's analog, of course, but those traditional news channels like the BBC and ITV, again, they are shedding audiences from 10 million watching, news at 10 just 10 years ago to maybe 3 million now, something like that. So literally, they're getting very scared. The mainstream media is losing its stranglehold over the national conversation and the national narrative. And that's why they have also migrated to social media, because that's where it's at. And they do have a lot of resources to pump into social media as well, and amplifying their content on social media. So, for example, all our content and your content, Paul, is organic. We haven't paid for any advertising. Whereas the BBC and others, they're spending millions on advertising, to amplify their content. So they do have an unfair advantage. But yes, you're right. Social media, has been a game changer. It's more of a level playing field now. And we also have international channels from other countries that have penetrated the consciousness of people, even in the UK. But there is a fight back going on from the establishment to curtail those international news channels. They've already banned Press TV and RT. I wouldn't be surprised at some point if they ban Al Jazeera as well. And also, even social media companies are, especially Mark Zuckerberg and previously Jack Dorsey, they were very, very quick to try to ban alternative content. Elon Musk, that's why there's so much demonization of Elon Musk.
So it's his platform, Elon Musk, X. I hate calling it X because for me, it's always going to be Twitter. X is meaningless. What does X mean? I don't know what that means. No, but is this the premier platform now for Muslims, reasonably-ish free speech? I know there are some issues, but certainly compared to the other platforms, is this the go-to place for news, do you think?
So Elon Musk is a free speech champion. Now, obviously, that comes with some positives and negatives. It means that people like Katie Hopkins and Tommy Robinson get to come back and spat their hatred. But I think that's the price we have to pay for us being able to express our minds on Twitter. That's why I was saying that there's so much demonization of Elon Musk in the mainstream, because he's annoying a lot of people by allowing people like me and you, for example, and many others to express themselves freely on Twitter. But I think if we're living in a secular country, Paul, like we are, and that is the dominant worldview and framework, then as Muslims, the most we can expect is to have, the ability to freely express ourselves. So we can't really call for bans on Tommy Robinson and others unless they cross the line to inciting violence. I think that's where the line needs to be drawn. If you literally incite violence, even if you're a Muslim and you're doing that, then you lose the privilege of free speech. But we're not doing that. You're not doing that. And Hizb ut-Tahrir aren't doing it either. So these bans are just, the irony is that Hizb ut-Tahrir will probably still be able to operate on social media. But
there was a previous, I know I don't like the referencing Hizb ut-Tahrir in the same breath as other prescribed or proscribed organizations, but I guess for the purposes of this, I will. There are other organizations that were banned, and they simply reinvented themselves by giving themselves a new label. And it's the same personnel, the same ideology. And they were able to carry on until the government then banned that one. And you had this kind of bizarre cat and mouse game. So, the personnel, the spokesman, and so on can continue, presumably, saying exactly what they have been. It's just they can't do it under the name of Hizb ut-Tahrir anymore. Yeah,
but unfortunately, it'll be worse than that. They'll probably go after their assets, and I don't know whether if they have an office. They'll probably go after their bank accounts, and so it's really nasty stuff, and it's not justified, and it's nasty and mean and vindictive, quite frankly. And unfortunately, Labour is supporting it, so it's going to go through.
Well, the Labour supported the government's line on opposing a ceasefire. They're just. That's another story. But do you think? This will be challenged in the courts, presumably.
Yes,
it's baseless.
It was challenged in the courts. There's a 90-day period where they can reverse the prescription. And if they refuse to reverse the prescription after court challenges, then I guess they can go all the way to the Supreme Court or the European Court of Human Rights. I'm not sure, but they will definitely bog the government down in litigation.
But the ban will still be enforced, though. Well, it's not like
it will be. It will be. So basically, after Friday. So you better put this podcast out quickly, because after Friday, we aren't even really allowed to have a frank conversation about Hizb ut-Tahrir.
No, I'm not sure I agree. I thought we weren't allowed to publicly support it and so on.
Yeah, it's a minefield. It's like talking about Hamas now. you know, we can trip ourselves up or whatever. So it's a minefield. So I think most Muslims, they don't really want to talk about Hamas publicly because they're on the terrorists. And it'll be the same with Hizb ut-Tahrir. We will inevitably self-censor.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the case on a whole range of things. I think, well, perhaps we can draw it to a close now. I really appreciate your time. We've gone forever, but you're very busy. Was there anything finally you just want to share with us all in terms of your work and the work of the news website, 5 Pillars?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've been very busy the last 3 months, incredibly busy because of what's going on in Palestine. And we've got a lot more traction as well. I mean, I'd rather have no traction, but Palestine be free and in peace, etc. But the unfortunate reality is whenever there's a crisis, people realize they need 5 pillars, you know, because we're probably the only completely free-speaking, even Muslim outlet in this country, in the English language, where we can, you know, literally our constitution is the Quran and Sunnah. It's not Ofcom, or it's not the Labour Party, or it's not a sect of Islam, you know, whether Sunni or Shia or Barelvi or Deobandi. Literally, we're here for all Muslims. And yeah, it's been an incredibly busy time. Of course, we're not allowed into Gaza. We would love to go to Gaza, and we will do as soon as we can. So we're working with local journalists to get us the information. We've taken on a lot of more resources in terms of videographers. We even hired a journalist called Robert Carter, who you'll know very well. We decided to throw more resources at this because this is a historic moment, and I really don't want to be part of the generation that loses Palestine. And I think the stakes are that high, you know, and I think we have to realize the stakes are that high as well. That, you know, obviously the Nakba happened in 48, the Aqsa happened, you know, in or the Aska, I think. What is the Palestinian term? I forget. In 1967, obviously the second disaster happened. I don't want to be part of the generation in 2024 that loses Masjid al-Aqsa, you know, and that's the stakes, that they will destroy Gaza, they'll move on to the West Bank, they'll deal with the Palestinians in Israel itself, and then they will literally take Masjid al-Aqsa, and then they will look to expand a greater Israel. These are the stakes. So I would literally, I don't want to be alive in that era, Paul. You know, I don't want to be living in that era, or to tell my children and future grandchildren that I was part of that era that lost Masjid al-Aqsa. So I think, obviously, we know that the UK is not the arena of jihad, but we can't tire. I see Muslims getting a little bit tired after 3 months of activism, but we're not allowed to get tired. You know, just look at our brothers and sisters in Gaza and what they've lost and how they've been slaughtered and massacred. Yet they still say La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. They lose their own children, but they still give thanks to Allah, and they say He is the best disposer of affairs. So what's the worst that can happen to us in this country? You know, maybe we might go to jail. Maybe we might have our possessions taken away. It's nothing compared to what the Palestinians are going through. So I think we should take our example for them. We shouldn't be scared by the dirty tactics of the authorities in this country. We shouldn't be scared into silence. And if that means we have to sacrifice some of our freedom, some of our wealth and possessions, then so be it. Because I've already taken the decision that I'm not going to be part of the generation that loses Al-Aqsa.
Okay, well, that's very inspiring words. Thank you very much indeed, Roshan. And from the news website, 5 Pillars, you're there on Twitter, you're there on many platforms, actually. I'll link to them in the description below. And long may your courageous vocation, your courageous work continue, inshallah. So thank you very much. Until next time.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.